In the dim expanse of recollection, with the year 1857 draped its gray shroud over the isolated hamlet of Thornridge in the hills of New Hampshire, there unfolded the quiet consecration of what the elders proclaimed a haven of restoration. The town, weary from the echoes of loss and the slow unraveling of old certainties, gathered in solemn assembly to bless the rising walls of the haven of renewal, an edifice dedicated to the reclamation of those young souls cast adrift by circumstance. Its founder, a woman of measured grace named Eleanor Voss, widow of a once prosperous merchant, spoke of duties owed to the fragile, of forging from abandonment a renewed covenant with order and sanctity. She was joined in this labor by her kin, a sister whose voice carried the weight of unspoken burdens, and a brother whose sermons invoked the stern necessities of submission to higher designs. Consider now the slow architecture of that place, how it presented itself as a bulwark against chaos. The structure, a sprawling frame of weathered stone and timber perched upon a ridge overlooking mist-laden fields, welcomed into its folds a procession of girls drawn from the margins, those orphaned by fever or misfortune, those severed from kin by poverty's indifferent hand. They arrived with the faint light of expectation still flickering within, believing the routines of prayer and labor might restore what the world had stripped away. Days commenced in hushed assemblies where words of elevation were intoned, followed by hours of instruction in the modest arts deemed fitting. The threading of needles, the recitation of texts that emphasized yielding and restraint. Meals were sparse, measured portions that mirrored the discipline of spirit over flesh. And in the evenings, as shadows lengthened across the halls, there came the periods of solitary reflection in upper chambers, spaces set apart for what was described as the deepening of inner surrender. Yet beneath this ordered surface, something vaster and more patient began its work. One might observe, if one lingered in the periphery as certain townsfolk did from afar, how the girls' forms gradually yielded to an unseen current. Their steps grew measured, their gazes turned inward, as if peering into depths they could not name. Conversations, once sparse threads of shared memory, faded into silences that pressed upon the air like a gathering fog. It was not sudden, this transformation. It evolved in increments so deliberate they evaded notice at first. A girl who had entered with the restless energy of youth might, after weeks, sit motionless during the assemblies, her hands folded with a precision that suggested not peace but a hollowing. Others developed a faint tremor, a hesitance in voice that echoed the hesitance of one who has begun to doubt the solidity of her own thoughts. In this progression, the visitors emerged as part of the rhythm, arriving under cover of dusk in conveyances unmarked and unremarkable. They were men of standing, those whose names graced the ledgers of commerce and governance, whose public words spoke of duty and decency. Their presence was framed as consultations on the spiritual welfare of the charges, meetings held in the upper reaches where the air grew thick with incense and murmured invocations. What transpired there remained veiled, yet the effect rippled downward through the ranks. The selected girls returned altered, carrying within them a weight that manifested as diminished appetite, as eyes that no longer quite met the light. The process was methodical, a slow extraction not of life alone, but of the essence that once animated resistance or inquiry. It was as if the institution itself had become a conduit, drawing forth the vitality of the vulnerable to sustain an equilibrium the world above demanded but dared not acknowledge. And here the contemplation deepens into the philosophical marrow of the matter. What is power, after all, if not the quiet necessity of consuming the unseen to preserve the visible? The haven operated not as aberration, but as the inevitable altar upon which civilized order erects its facade. The girls, severed from any claim to notice, became the unseen currency exchanged in the maintenance of respectability. Their gradual dissolution was no mere cruelty. It was a logical extension of a world that requires sacrifice to uphold its illusions of progress and piety. Each tremor in a young hand, each vacant stare during the assemblies, testified to a deeper truth, that innocence is not lost through accident, but harvested as the raw material from which the structures of authority are reinforced. To question this was to confront the void at the core of all such endeavors, the recognition that virtue itself is sustained only by the hidden devouring of what it claims to protect. Observe further how the psychological currents intensified, coiling around the inhabitants like roots seeking deeper soil. For those who remained longest, awareness dawned not as revelation, but as a creeping paralysis. One girl in particular, let us trace her inner descent without naming her as exception, began to perceive the patterns in the silence. She noted the correlation between the nocturnal arrivals and the subsequent fading of certain forms among her companions. She sensed the subtle administration of substances in the evening drafts, compounds that dulled the edges of perception while leaving the body functional enough for continued utility. Her mind, once a private sanctuary of quiet rebellion, became a battlefield of accumulating dread. The fear that to speak would invite swift erasure, the heavier fear that even silence offered no escape because the mechanism had already integrated her into its workings. Isolation bred not solidarity, but a fragmented awareness, where each girl guarded her diminishing self against the others, lest any shared glance betray the collective unraveling. The routines spiraled onward in their ritual precision. Mornings brought the assemblies where the founder's voice intoned the virtues of endurance, framing suffering as the pathway to an elusive refinement. Afternoons dissolved into labors that exhausted the body, preventing the mind from coalescing resistance. Evenings culminated in the upper chambers, where selections were made with the calm efficiency of one tending a garden whose fruits were destined for distant tables. The visitors partook in ceremonies of their own devising, invocations that blended the language of elevation with demands that stripped away the last veils of autonomy. What occurred was not chaos, but a structured erosion, a methodical reduction of the self to its most pliable remnants. The girls did not cry out in the manner of overt torment. Their agony manifested as the quiet inward collapse, the soul's gradual acquiescence to the proposition that its existence served only the perpetuation of the order above. Deeper still the ideas turn, revealing the existential weight that presses upon all who inhabit such spaces. To exist within the haven was to confront the truth that freedom is an illusion granted only to those who remain blind to the machinery. The world outside praised the institution as a model of compassion, its ledgers recording donations from the elite as proof of benevolence. Yet this praise was the very seal upon the tomb. Any flicker of awareness among the girls, or among the rare observer who glimpsed the pattern from the edges, served only to tighten the coils. Attempts at connection between the afflicted dissolved under the weight of enforced solitude. Inquiries from without were met with explanations of natural frailty, of the burdens inherent to reclamation. The psychological pressure mounted not through overt threat, but through the pervasive atmosphere of inevitability. The knowledge that the system was self-correcting, that exposure would merely prompt its reconfiguration elsewhere, in new forms bearing the same unnameable hunger. As seasons layered upon one another, the toll accumulated without fanfare. Forms diminished, some vanishing entirely under attributions of frailty or departure to distant kin. The remaining carried the marks inwardly, eyes that had learned to avert, voices reduced to whispers of compliance. The founder and her kin maintained their composure, their public demeanor a mirror of unassailable rectitude. Sermons grew more insistent on the theme of necessary yielding, framing the unseen costs as the eternal tax upon the unworthy. Yet in the private recesses of contemplation, even they perhaps sensed the hollowness, that their authority rested upon the same void they claimed to fill. The visitors continued their discreet pilgrimages, their satisfaction drawn from the assurance that the mechanism functioned without interruption. And so the cycle perpetuated, a slow, oppressive turning where each new arrival fed the insatiable equilibrium. Now the spiral reaches its inescapable core. What if the haven was never an isolated failing, but the distilled essence of the human arrangement itself? Power does not corrupt. It simply unveils the pre-existing requirement that some must be rendered invisible so that others may inhabit the light. The girl's suffering was not tragedy, but the quiet predicate upon which the town's sense of moral continuity depended. To imagine resistance was to entertain a delusion, for any challenge merely scattered the seeds of the same pattern into fresh soil. The truth, once perceived, offered no liberation. Only the heavier burden of carrying the knowledge that the abyss is not beneath the world, but woven through its every thread. No external force would intervene, for the structures that might have done so were themselves sustained by analogous hidden exchanges. The dread settled as a permanent residue, the realization that all endeavors of elevation, all claims to sanctuary, conceal the same devouring necessity. And in the end, as the years claimed the original edifice and its inhabitants dispersed into obscurity, the weight remained unresolved. The records, sealed away in archives of convenience, spoke only of routine closures and charitable transitions. The town moved onward, its memory selectively pruned, yet the pattern persisted in subtler iterations across the landscape of the era. Other havens, other veiled exchanges, the same slow erosion masked as necessity. There is no culmination here, no redemption in the unveiling. Only the enduring oppression of understanding that the human condition is this perpetual descent, where innocence serves as fuel for the engines of order, and the soul, once hollowed, echoes with the silence of unacknowledged complicity. The shadow does not lift. It simply shifts, pressing upon the present with the same patient, ritualistic inevitability that defined its origin, in the shadowed years that followed the quiet closing of the first edifice. When the ridge above Thornridge had been reclaimed by pine and silence, the pattern did not vanish. It migrated. By the decade's turn, another structure rose farther north, in the frost-bitten hollows near the Connecticut line, a place called the Sanctuary of Quiet Restoration. Its founder presented herself under a different name, softer spoken, cloaked in the gentle rhetoric of healing rather than reclamation. She spoke of trauma's long echo, of how the mind, once fractured by loss, could be patiently reassembled through disciplined withdrawal from the world's clamor. The pamphlets distributed in poor parishes described a voluntary retreat for young women whose lives had been interrupted by grief, illness, or the sharper interruptions of poverty. Admission was framed as a gift. The building itself appeared almost tender in its design. Pale limestone softened by ivy, narrow windows that caught the weak winter light like hesitant eyes, a central hall whose vaulted ceiling drew the gaze upward as though promising ascent. Inside, the atmosphere was one of deliberate hush. Footfalls were muffled by thick wool rugs. Voices never rose above a murmur. The daily cadence repeated with liturgical exactness. Dawn prayer recited in unison. A thin gruel taken in silence. Hours spent copying passages for volumes that emphasized renunciation of self. The afternoon walk in single file along gravel paths bordered by high yew hedges. Then the long evening sessions in small, windowless rooms where each girl sat alone with a single candle and a journal in which she was instructed to record only thoughts of gratitude. No one was forced. That was the crucial distinction maintained in every public utterance. Each girl had signed papers of consent, some with trembling hands, others with the numb relief of someone who no longer possessed alternatives. Yet consent, once given, became the mechanism through which the deeper architecture operated. To question the routine was to demonstrate ingratitude. To express discomfort was to prove that the work of restoration had not yet taken root. The logic was circular and therefore unbreakable. Doubt proved the necessity of further discipline. Over months, the alteration unfolded with the patience of frost creeping across glass. Skin paled as though light itself were being leached away. Eyes grew large and liquid, reflecting nothing but the candle they had stared into for hours. Hands, once quick, learned a slow, deliberate folding. Sleep came in shallow waves, interrupted by dreams that left no memory except a residual heaviness in the chest. The tremor appeared again, not dramatic, not theatrical, merely persistent, a faint vibration in the fingertips when holding a pen, a quiver in the lower lip when attempting speech. Physicians summoned from nearby towns diagnosed neurasthenia, a fashionable malady of the era, and prescribed rest. Rest was already the entire curriculum. Certain evenings carried a different timbre. Carriages, always black, always arriving after full dark, drew up to the discreet rear gate. The drivers remained seated. The passengers descended without lantern light and were conducted directly to the upper corridor. There the selected girls waited, already dressed in plain white linen that resembled both nightgown and winding sheet. No violence announced itself. Instead, there was ceremony. Slow recitation of verses about the beauty of surrender, the offering of small silver cups containing a bitter cordial, the arrangement of bodies according to preferences quietly communicated in advance. The acts themselves were conducted with a decorum so meticulous it felt sacramental. Afterward, the girls returned to their narrow beds, carrying no visible marks, only the deeper imprint of something irrevocable having been removed from inside them. The philosophical horror resides here, in the absence of melodrama. No one screamed. No chanskankith. The violation was administered with courtesy, documented in ledgers as acts of charity received. The men who came were never coarse. They were cultivated. They spoke of literature, of music, of the fragility of the feminine soul. They left donations recorded under the heading benevolent support. Their satisfaction derived not merely from possession, but from the exquisite confirmation that refinement and predation could coexist without contradiction. That the same hand could sign a check for orphan relief and later sign a receipt for use of one of those orphans. The contradiction existed only for those naive enough to believe virtue and appetite occupy separate spheres. For the girls who lingered longest, comprehension arrived in fragments too small to form protest. One might notice that the cordial always preceded the nights when carriages appeared. Another might realize that girls who wept during the copying sessions were assigned extra hours of solitary gratitude until weeping ceased. A third might understand, without ever articulating it, that the journal entries were collected not to be read by sympathetic eyes, but to map the progress of dissolution, which phrases of resistance have been replaced by phrases of acceptance, which memories have been overwritten by approved reflections. Awareness itself became another symptom to be treated. To see clearly was to prove that restoration was incomplete. The pressure was never loud. It was atmospheric. It lived in the way light dimmed earlier each day as autumn deepened, in a way the hedges seemed to grow taller week by week, in a way every door that should have led outward instead opened onto another corridor of the same building. Escape was theoretically possible, yet the world beyond had already been described so thoroughly as hostile, chaotic, undeserving, that the prospect felt like stepping into fire. Better the known diminishment than the unknown annihilation. This was the final refinement of control, to make captivity feel like the only safe place left. Years turned. Some girls departed, officially restored, though they moved through subsequent life like shadows with borrowed names. Others simply failed to appear at morning prayer one day. Their absence was explained as transfer to a sister institution farther west. The ledgers recorded these transitions with the same dispassionate penmanship used to note arrivals. The founder grew older, her voice thinner, yet the cadence of her addresses never altered. Gratitude, surrender, the beauty of becoming smaller so that something larger might shine through. And still the carriages came. No cataclysm interrupted the rhythm. No courageous informant slipped through the hedges at dawn. No ledger was smuggled into the hands of a righteous magistrate. The sanctuary simply continued until the money slowed, until the supply of suitable candidates thinned, until the founder's own body began its inevitable withdrawal. Then it closed, not in disgrace, but in the manner of businesses that have served their season. The building stood empty for a decade, then became a tuberculosis sanatorium, then a boys' reformatory, each new purpose layering fresh paint over the same bones. What remains is not a monument or a scandal preserved in yellowed newsprint. What remains is the quiet certainty that such places are never truly closed. They only change costume. The architecture of slow erasure persists because it answers a permanent human requirement: the need to consume without acknowledging consumption, to wound without leaving a scar that can be pointed to in daylight. The girls who passed through those corridors did not vanish into history's ledger of named atrocities. They dissolved into the background radiation of ordinary days. The faint tremor that still lingers in certain hands, the hesitance before speech that no one can quite explain, the instinctive flinch when a door closes softly behind. There is no trial waiting at the end of this account, no gallows, no survivors bearing witness on a courtroom bench. There is only the knowledge, heavy and unshareable, that the mechanism requires no named villain to function. It requires only the collective willingness to look away while the quiet work continues, and a shared, unspoken agreement that some lives exist primarily so that others may continue undisturbed. The corridor has not ended. It has merely turned another corner in the frost-laced turn of the century, when the calendar slipped past 1899 and the world pretended to awaken into a brighter age. The pattern simply adjusted its gait. It took the form of the retreat of silent renewal, erected in the narrow valley of Maple Hollow, Vermont, where the hills folded in upon themselves like pages of an unread ledger. The woman who called it into being presented no grand sermon this time. She spoke in the measured tones of science and mercy combined. She was known only as the matron, a figure whose gray hair and steady hands suggested decades spent tending wounds the world had already forgotten. Her stated purpose was the quiet mending of those whose spirits had been bruised by the new century's haste. Daughters of mill workers, widows' children, girls whose families could no longer afford the luxury of questions. Admission required nothing but a signature and the understanding that once inside, time would be measured differently. The building rose with deliberate modesty, low stone wings hugging the earth, windows placed high enough that the valley floor remained a distant rumor, corridors that curved gently so no straight line ever offered the illusion of escape. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of carbolic and dried lavender, as though cleanliness itself could be made holy. Mornings opened with the soft toll of a single bell, summoning the residents to a circle of chairs where each was invited to speak a single sentence of acceptance. Breakfast was taken in measured spoonfuls, each bite a reminder that the body must learn restraint. The hours that followed were given to what the matron called attentive stillness, sitting with eyes half closed, repeating phrases that slowly loosened the grip of memory. No books were permitted except those chosen by the house itself. No letters left unless first read aloud in the common room. The afternoon brought the garden walk, single file along paths bordered by walls of clipped boxwood, where the only sound was the scrape of shoes upon gravel and the occasional sigh that no one acknowledged. The alteration here was slower still, almost courteous in its patience. It began with the posture. Shoulders that once carried the weight of hunger now settled into a permanent droop, as though the spine itself had decided surrender was simpler. Voices thinned until they resembled the rustle of paper. Eyes learned to rest on the middle distance, seeing neither the walls nor the future. A faint tremor returned, traveling from wrist to fingertip whenever a pen was offered or a question posed. The matron noted these changes in a leather volume kept in the upper office, labeling them signs of progress. The girls themselves felt only a gradual emptying, as if some essential liquid were being drawn off drop by drop, leaving the vessel lighter, more transparent, easier to hold without spilling. Certain nights the carriages arrived again, fewer now, but no less inevitable. They came without lamps, wheels muffled by the valley's soft earth. The chosen residents were prepared in advance, bathed in water scented with herbs, dressed in the plain linen shifts that had become their second skin. They were led to the long room at the end of the east wing, where the matron waited with her silver tray of cordial. The visitors were men whose names appeared in the town's better ledgers: bankers, physicians, officials who spoke of progress and reform in daylight. Their presence was never announced. It was simply part of the rhythm. What unfolded was conducted with the same deliberate calm that governed every other hour. Slow gestures, murmured assurances, acts framed as the final stage of release. No one raised a voice. The girls returned to their beds carrying no bruises, only the deeper knowledge that something irreplaceable had been traded for the continued safety of silence. The existential weight pressed inward now, no longer confined to stone and schedule. For the longest residents, understanding arrived not as shock, but as recognition of a truth already half known: that the retreat was not an exception, but the inevitable shape taken by any system that claims to heal. The world outside had begun to speak of rights and education, of light and equality, yet still required hidden spaces where the inconvenient could be gently unmade. The tremor in the hands was not illness. It was the body learning to echo the tremor in the social order itself, the faint, persistent vibration that says some lives must be diminished so that others may continue their upward climb. To see this clearly was to feel the final dissolution, the self no longer resisting but participating in its own erasure, because resistance had been revealed as just another form of noise the machinery could not tolerate. The psychological pressure had evolved beyond threat or drug. It lived in the absence of alternatives. Each resident understood, without ever being told, that the valley outside had grown hostile to those who left unfinished. Families who had signed the papers now spoke of their daughters in the past tense. Employment offices asked for references the retreat alone could provide. The world had been reshaped so that return felt like exile. Thus the girls remained, learning to love the hush because the alternative was louder emptiness. They copied their acceptance phrases with hands that no longer shook from fear but from habit. They walked the garden paths, counting steps the way others once counted days until freedom. The matron's voice, when it addressed them, carried no menace, only the gentle certainty that this was the kindest possible arrangement. Seasons layered. Some residents were released into the wider world, carrying certificates of restored balance. Yet they moved through factories and parlors like figures cut from fog. Others simply ceased to appear at the morning circle. Their absence was recorded as transfer to higher care. The ledgers remained immaculate. The carriages continued their discreet visits, fewer each year, as the new century's louder machines demanded different forms of consumption. The matron aged into a softer silhouette, yet the cadence of her instructions never faltered. Acceptance, stillness, the grace of becoming less. And still the tremor passed from wrist to fingertip. No door was ever forced. No ledger was ever seized. No voice ever rose in the valley to name what had been done. The retreat simply completed its cycle when the last donations slowed and the last suitable candidates thinned. The building was sold to a textile concern, then to a state hospital for the nervous, each new tenant painting over the same faint scent of lavender and carbolic. The valley returned to its habitual quiet. What lingers is not memory, but residue. It lives in the way certain women of a certain age still fold their hands too precisely when speaking of their youth. It lives in the hesitation before answering a simple question, as though every reply must first be weighed against an invisible ledger. It lives in the collective agreement never to look too closely at any place that promises to fix what the world has broken. The pattern requires no founder now, no carriages, no cordial. It has learned to travel through blood and silence, through the small daily choices that prefer comfort to recognition. The corridor has not ended. It has simply widened until it is indistinguishable from the world itself, and every step taken within it feels, at last, like ordinary walking that in the final decades before the calendar turned once more, when the 20th century had grown old and weary of its own promises, the pattern no longer required buildings. It had learned to live without walls. No new edifice rose. No founder appeared with gentle words or silver trays. Instead, the mechanism dispersed, threading itself into the ordinary textures of hospitals, boarding houses, reformatories, church basements, private clinics, halfway homes, and the locked upper floors of respectable families who could afford discretion. It wore the language of care, of therapy, of spiritual direction, of necessary correction. It spoke in softer registers now, clinical notes, intake forms, progress reports, discharge summaries. The tremor still traveled from wrist to fingertip, but doctors called it side effects, anxiety, conversion disorder, psychosomatic overlay. The vacant gaze was labeled dissociation, trauma response, adjustment difficulty. The slow emptying was documented as successful stabilization. Girls continued to arrive, though they were no longer called girls. They were patients, residents, clients, cases. They signed different papers now, voluntary commitment forms, treatment plans, consent for medication. The cordial had become capsules. The ritual a quiet hour behind a closed door with a man in a white coat or a gray suit who spoke of healing while his hands moved with the same deliberate calm. No carriages were needed. Appointments were scheduled. Invoices sent, insurance reimbursed under codes that sounded technical and neutral. The violation was administered in 15-minute increments, charted, billed, filed. Afterward, the girl was returned to the ward with instructions to rest, to journal gratitude, to practice breathing exercises that taught the lungs not to rise too high. The existential pressure had become atmospheric, ambient, omnipresent. It no longer needed a single place, because it had colonized every place that claimed to mend. To enter any institution that promised restoration was to step into the same corridor that had once been stone and now was simply expectation. The expectation that discomfort proved the need for more treatment, that resistance confirmed the diagnosis, that clarity of mind was dangerous and must be medicated away. Awareness itself had been pathologized. To remember too sharply was to be non-compliant. To speak plainly was to lack insight. The tremor in the hand was no longer a sign of something taken. It was evidence that the medication was working. Some survived long enough to leave. They carried the residue outward, the habit of folding hands too neatly, the pause before answering any question that felt like evaluation, the instinctive shrinking when a door closed with a soft click. They married, worked, raised children, smiled at neighbors. Yet certain hours of the night still carried the scent of lavender and carbolic even when no such smell was present. They taught their daughters, without ever saying the words, to lower their eyes when certain men entered the room, to speak in measured sentences, to accept correction as love. The pattern replicated not through force but through transmission, a quiet curriculum passed mother to daughter, patient to nurse, teacher to student, case file to case file. Others did not leave. Their charts grew thicker, their stays longer, their discharges deferred until the body itself decided the matter. When they were gone, the record read natural causes, complications, cardiac events secondary to long-term pharmacotherapy. No inquest followed. The ledger remained clean. By the centuries, in the carriages had become cars, then taxis, then rides summoned by phone. The men no longer needed to arrive under cover of darkness. They came during office hours, briefcases in hand, appointment cards in pocket. The silver tray had become a prescription pad. The white linen shift had become a paper gown open at the back. The ritual had become routine, and still no one raised a voice loud enough to break the hush, because the hush had become the condition of safety itself. There is no final room, no last corridor, no moment when the door opens onto daylight and the mechanism shudders to a halt. There is only the gradual recognition, slow as frost across a window, that the corridor never had walls to begin with. It was always the space between what is said and what is done, between the promise of care and the practice of consumption, between the tremor that signals damage and the diagnosis that calls the tremor normal. The girls are no longer hidden beneath floorboards or behind high hedges. They walk among us, sit beside us on buses, stand behind counters, type in cubicles, teach in classrooms, lie awake beside sleeping partners. Their voices are quiet now, trained to moderation. Their hands still carry the tremor when they reach for a cup or sign a form or comfort child. They do not speak of what was taken because the language for it has been rewritten as illness, as exaggeration, as something best left unmentioned. And the world continues, polite and orderly, building new institutions that promise healing while quietly requiring the same ancient offering. Some lives thinned so that others may remain comfortably thick. The pattern has not ended. It has only learned to breathe more softly, so softly that most never notice the sound of their own diminishing.